Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I know a lot of you had a very long day, but as we like to say, we like to keep the best for last. My name is Yusuf Gameluddin, and I am still an anchor with Bloomberg TV, just like I was this morning. So I am very glad to be back with you. This one I really wanted to do. So in the conversations I had with organizers, I was like, I need to do the one on trade and globalization. There's just so much to talk about. And if you take a look at the political winds around the world with what's been happening with US foreign policy, or US trade policy more specifically, with the withdrawal from the TPP, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, threatened to revamp or rejig NAFTA, and just a very general anti-trade view, it's definitely raised a lot of questions. And then more broadly, it has raised a lot of questions about, well, does free trade live up to what it needs to in terms of delivering to people's well-being? We've got a very distinguished panel lined up for you. I'd like to introduce them individually. We were joined by His Excellency Sultan bin Saeed Al Mansouri. He's the Minister of Economy for the United Arab Emirates. We also have with us Roberto Azevedo. He's the Director General for the World Trade Organization. Archana Gonzalez, she is the Executive Director for the International Trade Center. And Mukisa Kitui, he's the Secretary General for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Please, let's give them a warm round of applause. Roberto, I'll start with you from a World Trade Organization perspective, and just pose the simple question: is free trade as we know it at risk? Because if I'm watching mainstream media, if I'm reading mainstream newspapers, it's the kind of sense I'm getting.
Well, it's less obvious than it was before. I have no doubts about that, particularly with the new trends where you see political shifts in major economies. So we see a lot of reports today. I'm sure your chain of TV does that quite often. Shifts in terms of the roots of voters going against globalization, going against the imported products, in short, being against anything that is foreign, which is a threat to them. And I think that this kind of feeling is permeating a little bit the political environment. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has an economic background. It is not necessarily rational. And that's precisely this very emotional side of the conversation that we need to address. Why is this happening? Why are politicians responding to this? Yeah. And I think the wrong answer is to go against trade.
Right.
Clearly, that's not the way forward, because it's not going to solve anything. On the contrary, it's going to aggravate things, and it's going to be ineffective.
Let's pick up on that. The politics then getting a lot more momentum against trade and against globalization. Minister, I'd like you to weigh in as well, because just before we came on here, you were telling me, Yusuf, I don't like where this is going because we're working so hard to liberalize borders, and then we're getting pushback.
Well, definitely. Good afternoon first. Definitely, I'm really very surprised how politicians who should have really a keen interest to see open free trades are actually working against it, just for, I'm sorry to say, for political gains. The world under the WTO have gained a lot actually through these organizations. They worked very hard toward creating these harmonized systems at the WTO. But I see it also from our side here in the UAE at another level, which is at the level of the region, which is facing a lot of challenges politically, stability, and so on. And then we have agreements, including, of course, the Greater Arab Free Trade Agreements, which we should be benefiting from that. But politicians, again, for their gains, are also putting restrictions in the flow of free trade between different Arab nations. If they look at the benefits of what we have gained as the UAE over the years, our trade is worth about 425 billion US dollars. This is huge. But we have also invested in the infrastructure over the years to make sure, the ability of trade to move around, but also to create the trust in a country, in a system that is able also to basically move on goods all around the world, but also benefit from it. To set up an example, because what I'm doing here is drawing on some of these restrictions that is being put by nations, both in our region and around the world, but also showing the benefit of prosperity that can be gained from that.
Yeah.
And that's why I do not understand this sort of political message, the politicization. I cannot even use that word because it's so hard sometimes to pronounce it, because I'm against it. We should not really do something like that as politicians, as leaders. And
Right.
maybe eventually they will discover the problem of using that also.
Yeah, and we'll get back to more of your thoughts. I want to bring in Mokisa on this. If you look back over the last year, and again, you're overseeing a very wide global remit, has it become more difficult to deliberate and to make decisions because of the kind of political pushback individual countries, your member states are facing?
Well, I see the politics like the Honorable Minister said, but the number of issues that I think are underlying the anger against trade, unless you deal with the fundamentals that create this anger, you'll continue blaming trade for mistakes that originate elsewhere. Over the past 30 years, trade has liberated more than 500, 600 million people out of extreme poverty, not just in China and India, in a lot of emerging economies, with Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, the Gulf area. But having said that, that same period coincides with the retreat of the welfare state in the industrialized countries. And secondly, the drivers of a liberalized trade regime were multinational corporations, often at the peril of small and medium enterprises, which are critically important for the middle class and for the consumer economy. Now, a flawed globalization has left a lot of people feeling vulnerable, particularly in the traditional industrialized countries. And this anger is being exploited by politicians. So trade is a simple thing to accuse, but it's just being used as a charade against fundamental social flaws that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
So to deal with the legitimate role of trade as a liberative force, you have to address in those countries investment in social skills, in social infrastructure, in retooling the labor force, and make it competitive again in the face of competitive areas and new technologies.
But there's also the other side of that conversation. I'm going to play devil's advocate because for years, free trade has been sold as, well, as the buzzword. Everything is free trade, bring down barriers, free flow of goods and services, and everything becomes better. And there is a real disenchantment with people with free trade. I mean, people are just like, all right, I'm not so sure what the real impact is on my life. I'm trying to make ends meet. I'm trying to feed my kid. I'm trying to put him through school. I'm not seeing the difference. I mean, it sounds good on paper. I'd like to get you now into the conversation as well. How do you look at this?
Well, if I'm sitting in Bloomberg's office in Washington, and let me tell you that I don't spend a lot of time in Washington these days, then free trade does not sound very attractive. But if I'm sitting in Bloomberg's office in Nairobi, in Santiago, in Hanoi, and the list goes on, trade is very attractive. Because now finally I can go beyond my little domestic market. I can access international markets. I can become more competitive. And through that, I can earn a better income. So, depends on where you ask this question. The problem we have is that a lot of the Bloombergs are sitting in Washington.
I knew you were going to come out with the guns
sitting
firing.
in Nairobi. So maybe you have to ask these questions in other parts of the world where trade is seen as a means. And here the question is whether we think trade is an end in itself, and sometimes maybe we have sold trade as being the panacea of
Well, that is what I'm trying to get at, is that it's been oversold. Have there been real benefits? Sure, there have been. But again, the political wins are coming, and as you mentioned as well, based on real issues that people are facing. It's not people are just taking it out on trade. They feel that their lives have not been improved sufficiently because of it. But is there, I mean, how fundamental a risk do you see to free trade? We're in a time where we see the US President Donald Trump firing left and right on anything that has to do with a trade agreement, even though it hasn't reflected in actual trade policy yet. I mean, it hasn't, I mean, yes, with the TPP, but we have yet to see with NAFTA and some of the others. But are you concerned about this being a global phenomenon or not? Because the panel, for the most part, seems to think it is a concern.
No, I see in the world two tendencies. On one side, you've got those who believe that to be most sovereign, they have to retreat behind national borders, behind national walls. They have to isolate themselves, and they have to work it for themselves. And you've got another big part of the world that thinks that to be most sovereign, they have to collaborate more. They have to cooperate more. They have to open more, but they have to do this within a framework of rules. And the jury is out, frankly, on who is right in their approach. But just as I see the President of the United States maybe be more on the first camp, I also see many others on the other camp. I see the Prime Minister of Japan in the other camp. I see the Prime Minister of Canada. I see the President of Rwanda, who chairs the African Union, who's going to create a mega free trade agreement between all African nations in 1 month. So the jury is out. But one thing is for sure. We have to stop thinking trade is an end. Trade is a means. And if it's one tool in your toolbox, but if you don't have any other tools and you don't put it to work with other tools, then for sure you are not going to address the fundamental problems that the huge transformations that our societies and our economies are going through will create for the individual citizens.
It doesn't make it any easier when you have something like the United States with that kind of size of economy and influence and political muscle, not necessarily putting up the flag of completely free trade and suddenly saying, you know what, America first, we're changing our priorities. I take your point about there are a lot of other voices that are still around the free trade argument, but not having the US on board is a setback if you take a look at the last decade or two. I want to get perhaps some views on whether maybe institutions like the WTO and others need to reform and need to adapt to a changing world where we have, again, different political sentiment or sentiment that's pushing against free trade. And also, we've got a lot of technologies kicking in, and we'll get to technology a little bit later in the conversation. But first, institutional reform. What's your take?
Well, before that, just one point. I think my jury is in. And my jury is...
In where?
In the sense that the jury is not out for me, that my jury is in, and that jury says trade is innocent. It's not about trade. I mean, a lot of these movements and political trends that you see in major economies have nothing to do with trade. Trade is a scapegoat, but it's not the cause, the root cause. What is the problem there? These people who feel that they are being left out, governments are not looking after them, they're losing their jobs, they are under threat. All of that, or mostly that trend responds to new technologies, innovation, changes in the labor market. And those changes are not provoked by trade. Those changes are promoted by innovation. 8 out of 10 jobs that are lost in advanced economies, they are lost to new technologies. It's computers, artificial intelligence, new managerial skills. Has nothing to do with trade. And those 8 people, that lost their jobs, they blame the cheap import, they blame changes, they blame the immigrant, for example. It's not the reason. Now, we have to put the right perspective in this conversation. And I think part of the job of the multilateral institutions like the WTO, that ITC, is to let people understand that by addressing this concern, by curbing trade, they are hurting themselves. And this is not going to solve anything. Now, we have to be ready for the new world. And I think that's what we need to do. We have a study of a consultancy firm, recent study, that shows that today in 54 countries that were surveyed, about 64% of the jobs were under threat of automation. That's huge. That's almost 2/3 of the labor force. And this is going to happen. these major structural changes are going to happen, and new technologies are going to evolve. They are going to change the face of the world. In this region, for example, energy. Energy in the next 20 years is going to undergo a very transformative process. Now, how is that going to affect the world? That's the kind of conversation we need to have. In institutions like mine, what we're trying to do is to promote this conversation, and those countries who have misgivings about where we are in terms of trade, we're trying to show them that, trade is actually one of the solutions for this. I think we've been successful in many ways. There is more engagement now. Countries that were rejecting the notion of having a conversation about trade, now they are. They're beginning to talk. I hear a lot about fair trade, and well, that's part of the conversation. If you feel that this is unfair, how do we make it fair?
Well, that's the point that Danny Roderick would make. And I was reading through one of his articles just the other day, and he says, well, economic openness produces winners and losers, right? So you don't say no to trade, you don't say no to globalization, but the losers need to be compensated. Minister, I'd like, again, to get you to weigh in on this.
Yes, I agree with Secretary General of the WTO on the point that it's not, the problem is not with trade. It's at the end of the day, as we started with, is how politicians sometimes use it in a way to create certain stance on trade. But I would like to comment also on the WTO and the role of the WTO. I think it has been, it's the only platform we have available, a global platform that we have available to address so many other issues. We have no other options. But also we have the challenge of the representation of the countries in there, which is basically in terms of the level of their economic developments. Because we have the less developed, developing, and the highly developed nations, which is in this case, do we deal with all of them with the same kind of level of addressing these concerns when it comes to trade? Do we actually need to give them some kind of status, especially the less developed, which we are doing to a certain extent, but we need to make sure under these circumstances, do we just let them go while other nations are building walls when it comes to free trade? I think we have a responsibility also as nations to help these less developed countries, less developed nations, if we really want a proper balanced development of the economies of these nations. So we cannot isolate these nations aside. Another area is there is the consensus, which is it has to be 100% when it comes to some of the decisions passed through the WTO. All nations have to approve it, which I think it's almost, and I saw Your Excellency during some of the meetings in Bali, and some of the differences that happen over there, and how hard you work actually with your team to get the agreements between, I don't want to mention the nations there, between these different nations on certain stance. You can imagine if one nation only reject, all of the hard work of so many years sometime is put off for another meeting, which is going to be sometime after that. So we need, I think your questions, what do we need to really look at the regulations that we have in there? Yes, we do have to look at that. And that's why I bring in the status of the different nations, the position of these three status of the nations, that we need to address them differently, but make sure that we qualify them to that level and then move them hopefully to another level.
I see two people nodding here on the rest of the panel. I'll start with
yes,
you. Yeah.
I'll just pick up from there. 15 years ago, I was the Minister of Trade, and our agenda at WTO was basically the same as it is today. Now, 15 years later, I feel, however good an institution is, if a core problem is hostage to two forces, disagreement on new issues, intransigence on all issues, you have to find a solution. You cannot hold global rule-making hostage to this. So we have to admit there's a problem. It may not be intrinsic to the institution, but I think partly the notion of full consensus on some issues was politically very nice sounding, but it's very, very, very difficult to implement in a real world. But apart from that, you have a problem also. Multilateralism is confronted not just by the problems of skeptics about trade, about believers in mercantilist notions of dog-eat-dog society, 19th century sense of trade exchanges, but also believe in deals that you can bilaterally fix things much more faster than when you are going multilaterally. I think these are some challenges. But at the core of it, again, inclusion. The libertarian notion that just trade opening up markets fixes social problems is dubious. Trade creates wealth, but society fixes the questions of equality and inclusion.
Yeah.
Investing in skills, investing in the productive capacity and transformation of vulnerable societies, investing in social cushioning for those who are threatened by trade and technology is part of a social responsibility that will always be there, whether there is multilateral negotiation at WTO or not. But it cannot be always put at the doorstep of the multilateral process. Having said that, part of your question you asked, can we find other ways of moving forward? One, we have to reclaim high ground for inclusion. Global solutions need global engagement. And the spirit of Agenda 2030 is that we belong to a small place together. Planet, people, and profit must be balanced. And that notion has to percolate even in the rule-making negotiations.
I mean, let me jump in here, and then we can come back to you as well, because I want to get to that point of inclusion. Again, that is the issue. It's not the issue that the United States is doing something on its own. A more isolationist United States, a more inward-looking United States creates more other inward-looking nations as well around the world. So you have the likes of Mexico and China. They're going to start looking inwards. They're going to start raising tariffs. They're going to start raising their borders. I want to go to you as well to get your view on adaptation of institutions, perhaps. Yeah.
I mean, I like to think of the WTO as an insurance policy. It's an insurance policy that is the collective insurance policy for insertion into the world economy, and mostly to avoid doing that by unilateral means, by protectionist means. But this insurance policy has to be like any insurance policy that we have for our houses, for our cars, against theft. It has to be regularly adapted. Now, the biggest adaptation that, in my view, this policy requires today is in that the form of trade has fundamentally changed from when this policy was subscribed last time, which was 1995. Today, the biggest and fastest growing part of international trade is called electronic commerce. And this cannot simply be ignored. This insurance policy has to be updated to cover this new form of trade, which today represents already 13% of trade in goods, and which is growing exponentially. So my sense is that rather than going into maybe breaking the rule on consensus, you see when consensus means not taking into account the view of a country that represents 20% of international trade is a little bit complicated. And rather focus on trying to build this consensus on the areas that matter today and that matter most, not just for the big companies, but in particular for the smaller ones.
Yeah, and you raised the point of e-commerce and of technology, and that is really at the crux as well in terms of how we look forward to what these institutions are going to look like in a few years' time, and also the impact it's going to have, because you've got quite a few scholars who've written a lot of research about a world that's hyper-digitized, about countries being left out of industrialization completely because of that. I mean, at the WTO, how do you factor in, how do you regulate or even begin to regulate technology?
Well, we're struggling with that, not in the usual sense. I think the WTO is somehow in transformation as we speak. We spent years deciding whether or not we should be talking about these transformative technologies. For example, e-commerce. In Buenos Aires just recently, something very different happened. You had more than 70 countries signing up declarations saying that they want to discuss e-commerce. So it is an open-ended conversation. The members who want to come to talk about it will be welcome to have that conversation. Those who don't, they don't. If you want to leave, you leave. If you want to come in, you come. So it's a very flexible kind of environment, and I think that's exactly the kind of transformation we need. Consensus, yes, for multilateral rules, but we have to be flexible in having this discussion. And I think that's what's going to happen. E-commerce, every time we sit around the table, right now, if you ask each one of us what e-commerce is, you get 4 different answers. Each one is going to focus on something different. And e-commerce is a universe in itself. So we need to have a conversation about what are the priorities, what are the challenges. Is it what? Data flows? Is it server localization? Is it consumer protection? Is it legality of digital contracts? And the list goes forever. Return of merchandise, everything in e-commerce is unexplored. So this is the kind of conversation that we're going to have in the WTO. The first thing is map out what the priorities are, where the challenges are, even very basic challenges like connectivity. More than 4 billion people in the world today don't have access to the internet. So how do you talk about e-commerce when there are some countries who face very basic challenges like electric energy? So that conversation has to happen. It is beginning in the WTO. They're already meeting, and I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of that.
Minister?
Well, e-commerce is a challenge actually to all of us as government representative, because it was mentioned earlier, the issue of regulating this. Laws and regulations are not mature enough in most of the countries around the world addressing the e-commerce, including our nation here. And then the other problem is this is a race without an end line, because as we try to regulate and put the laws and regulations there, the whole technology keeps changing. Yeah. This is one side of it. The second, we need a common coordinated platform that connects us together on this, because, you know, as mentioned earlier, trade have no barriers. But if I buy something from the net, or e-commerce in that case, from any part of the world, as a consumer, what sort of protection do I have for that? That is not regulated yet. So there is actually a gap in there that somehow need to be addressed. Maybe one platform can be done through the WTO, but nations has to work together on it. Then I want to look at the other full side of the cup, which is how we can actually utilize this also to help less developed nations. Because if they want to make a leap on this, they need to be part of this. Otherwise, again, they will lose on this new sort of revolution that is happening right now, by which they can, at the end of the day, especially the SMEs within these nations, can be part of this, hopefully, journey that it would take them and address some of the issues that they have within their trade, economy, and many other areas. Third, and this is maybe also not only unique to the UAE, but also to many other nations, we invested a lot in shopping malls, infrastructures, and so many other things. And we see what is happening also when it comes to the style and type of shopping that is happening right now, which is mainly going through the e-commerce. All these platforms offer so much choices, and specifically for the younger generation. I mean, that's something that we have to think about. How do we address all of this investment that has been put here and many other parts of the world? Is that the end of the malls or not? Do we go ahead with our plans to expand on this here and globally? We do not know the answers yet.
Yes, may I just start off where you left off first? The issue of protectionism in the US and whether others are also going to start turning inwards, I don't think is so obvious and automatic. First, because the US in the long term is the main beneficiary of universally enforced protection of intellectual property rights. And I think the political ripple we are seeing is short term. But secondly, countries like China have responded not by turning inwards, but by creating new initiatives on outward-looking engagements, like the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is interlocking regions, but trying to address questions of how can we also ensure that others benefit as we benefit from international engagement. Now, if I may turn to the issue of electronic commerce, I lead an institution which is the Secretariat of the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, but also we publish an annual UN report on the digital economy. We see the exponential growth of e-commerce. But for us, it's not just about creating rules for e-commerce. It's how do we enable to spread the benefits from this phenomenon, which is addressing the gaps between developed and developing countries, the vulnerable and the stronger within countries, issues like broadband inclusion, issues of privacy rules, the fraud exclusion, developing local content. These are developmental issues that can be adjusted with as we move along with this phenomenal capacity, or growing component of commerce. I think it makes sense to say, let us look at areas where the absence of international agreement limits the speed at which e-commerce can be a liberative force. Like as Avedo mentioned, the absence of clear rules on cross-border electronic commerce, like on return goods, on privacy, and even the commercialization of so-called confidential and commercial information like personal data for purpose of advertisement. So these are issues we can engage on rulemaking, but don't take away the eye from the liberative and integrative force and potential of electronic commerce, even for vulnerable groups.
It's a potent point. I saw you were nodding as well, Arantxa.
Look, technology, for me, the biggest feature of technology is its force to disrupt. And we have to be conscious that disruption may mean a lot of good, but it also means pain. So let me just first deal with the pain part, because we can't just simply deal with the positive. We also have to deal with the negative. Disruption and technology will mean jobs will be lost. It will mean that lots of people will lose the jobs that they have today, and they will have to be supported in adapting to the jobs that maybe we don't know today. I was at a session yesterday, and it was phenomenal. Basically, 85% of the kids that are 6 years of age today will have jobs in the future that we don't know today. So that's the kind of huge disruption that is coming to us. We have to prepare for that. Now, for me, technology in trade has also an incredible force for good, which is size and distance matters less than agility. And this means to me that the base of our economic pyramid, that is smaller businesses, businesses that are very often in very distant places, businesses that are in the hands of women and youth, can connect to international trade if they are fast, if they are agile, if they can innovate, if they create. And that's what we have to capitalize on. And let me illustrate this with a figure. You know, 1 out of 5 companies exporting in offline trade is a woman-owned business. 1 in 5, which tells us that we have a bit of an issue worldwide. But in electronic commerce, 4 out of 5 are women-owned businesses. The digital economy, when you shop, you don't know who's selling. What you care is about what you're buying. So it can be an enormous force for good. Yeah. This is why we have to nurture it, but we also have to make sure that we don't forget the disruptive nature.
I mean, you talked about what you're doing at the WTO, just to pick up on sort of the transformation with technology and some of the other areas you're working on. You're saying, well, the politics gets in the way, but it's not completely disruptive of how you're conducting business. At least you're keeping the ship afloat, as it were. What else would you say is a really big challenge for you, trying to get everybody around what is an ethos for globalization and free trade that sort of seems to be emblematic of what the WTO stands for? I mean, what are you grappling with? I mean, it's tech, it's politics. What else is an issue?
Yeah, I think the first thing about this new agenda, if we can call it that way, is that you cannot forget the old agenda. And the old agenda is still very much present today. For example, agricultural subsidies. That still disrupts a lot of the trade competitive balance in the world. And developing countries in particular are still very keen on addressing that because they feel, you know, we're going uphill. We're not competing against the farmers of developed countries, we are competing against the treasuries of developed countries. So that conversation cannot disappear, and there are many members in the WTO who fear that by talking about e-commerce and all these other new areas, that people will forget the old part. So the first thing to say is that agenda has to be very much on the table. It cannot leave the table. Now, having said that, there are challenges in several areas. In Buenos Aires, in our last ministerial conference, there were 4 areas that we found declarations signed up by more than 70, 80 delegations. And in one case, empowerment of women, more than 100 delegations signed up. The other areas were e-commerce, of course, investments facilitation, so how to facilitate the establishment of businesses and how to attract investments. And the third one was small and medium enterprises. Small and medium enterprises, they account to around between 60 and 90% of the workforce in most countries. And that goes for both developed and developing countries. And Arantxa just made the case of how these new technologies help the inclusiveness, how much easier it is for small and medium enterprises to fit in. But my point is, if you close your arms today and let the new technologies and these new platforms take their course with no government help for the small and medium enterprises, the e-commerce world, this digital world, will be dominated by the big ones. And the small and medium enterprises who have a huge potential here will be left behind. So we have to ensure that they are part of this. And it's not that difficult. You know, just providing the means, education, skills, the legislation and the framework, they can compete with big companies on a par, almost, if we help them. And that's what we want to do in the WTO at this point in time.
I think it'd be great to get a view of a member state.
I'll take
how
it
you
from,
see it on the other side.
I'll take it from another dimension. The austerity measures of the financial crisis actually stopped many nations and governments from investing in the infrastructure. Infrastructure are very important when it comes to the facilitation of trades. And we see it, and yesterday we had the Prime Minister of India and we were discussing this. We see it in a nation such as India. And it's a powerful, emerging economic power, but still have the challenge of infrastructure. Ports, airports, railway systems, the roads, and everything is problematic for them there. We are also investing in it as UAE. But this is actually a global situation that we are still facing a problem with. So I do believe this is one of the areas for many nations they need to invest. They could also attract investment in these sectors, such as ours, and we have done probably a great job in terms of investing in ports. And we have the expertise, and aviation also is another area. But when it comes to railway system, highways, and so on, that's, we can leave it with others. But I think this is one of the areas we should not really forget about when it comes to some of the challenges to trade that we could face also continuously future-wise.
I think fundamentally it just ties up the debate. Trade has demonstrated the capacity to be a solution for developmental challenges. But trade and globalization have to be fixed to be the solution and not to continue being a scapegoat for lack of solutions. Digital economy, with the possibilities of networking, making electronic visibility possible for small businesses, rural, vulnerable women producers, its absence of a gender as a phenomenon represent the potential that treated rightly, it can cure some of the problems of globalization which have manifested themselves in populist anger against trade and redeem trade as a force for good.
I mean, in terms of giving credit to the relative successes, I'm going to call it that, just to put it in context of free trade, and I like the piece by Daniel Gross. He said that free trade and globalization took the credit of a 2 decades long commodities boom. And so when that blew up a little bit, the effects of that were quickly gone, and people were starting asking questions about free trade instead of asking questions about a commodities boom that ended. Arantxa, I mean, your work at the International Trade Center, and perhaps to complement what some of the other panelists have been saying, politics, technology, reform. I mean, what else is on your radar specifically as you talk to a lot of people around the world, delegations?
So what we try to do is help on the ground, starting with changing the narrative. And the first narrative we have to change is that trade protectionism doesn't protect. That what protects is investing in skills, investing in infrastructure, investing in supporting the base of the pyramid participate in international trade. And it matters that they participate in international trade. You know, It's true that SMEs represent 70% of employment in any country. They are more than 98% of businesses in any country, but they contribute very little to GDP. And this is because they are not competitive. So our task is to help them improve their competitiveness, and trade is a tool to become more competitive. So change the narrative. Demonstrate that you can use international trade intelligently to make your economy grow in a more inclusive manner.
And again, this ties back to overselling what free trade stands for and what it can offer a little bit. What I want to find out, though, is what's happening with this US administration. I want to go back to that, and also how we can put it into context, because it appears we haven't had anything like this in recent history in terms of, well, perhaps until the days of the Cold War, until 1990, 1989. But since then, since we've been on this bullet train of, I'm going to say, opening up and liberalizing, we haven't had a large power that really stood against free trade as vocally when they were initially a big proponent. So it's quite a switch. It's quite a difficult exercise mentally to have the United States say, hey, we're against free trade. Aren't you guys you were holding the flag of free trade not too long ago. Is there more politics now? I mean, at the WTO, are you having to deal with a lot more politics now than you had to deal with 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago?
I would say so, but if anything, I don't think that free trade was oversold. I think it was undersold. Most people don't realize the benefits of trade. And I think that's one of the biggest problems. I think in terms of the politics that you just mentioned, there are asymmetries in trade. I think clearly there are countries that are more competitive, others that are less competitive. There are new players in the global agenda, in the global scenery as well, that were not there 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Now they are big players, and these things disrupt. And of course, when you are a big economy, whichever economy it is, and I'm not talking about the United States alone, I mean any other big economy, the temptation is to fix things unilaterally. You say, I'm big enough, I have a big enough market, I am powerful enough, others have to play my game. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, this is going to be unfair, I'm not going to be part of this conversation. But the game of international economics today is much more interconnected. It's a lot more interdependent than it ever was before. So this unilateral temptation may be there, but implementing it is trickier than it looks. So what you see today is a realization that this interdependency and this interconnectedness is much stronger than people believed. So at the end of the day, the way forward, I have no doubt, and that will be the end of the road, will be international cooperation. They will have to sit down, we will have to sit down and talk to each other and understand how can we together move forward.
I mean, it's very clear in the case of China and the US, when they developed such a strong codependency that despite the rhetoric from one side or the other, the fundamental relationship in terms of trade and goods and services is still going to be very much intact. Mukisa, I'm seeing you writing a few notes. Are you?
Yes, if I may, I think while protectionism is not in step with a world that wants to see itself as a common village, sometimes we are oversubscribing to protectionism, the challenges that we face. It is bad, but it's not the whole story. I think surging global demand and global trade, if you look at trade in goods, since the crisis of 2008, has been recovering very, very slowly. We've just finished a decade of trade growing at less than global GDP. And to me, that sluggish recovery in demand, global demand, is at least as much a culprit as protectionism. But there's a second thing. The potential of international trade to be a liberative force for inclusion is held back by the absence of a clear link between trade facilitation and investment facilitation. So to be part of the solution is how do we structure facilitation to include building capacity to put something into the marketplace, not just making it easy to trade. And that narrative will substantially go a good way in demonstrating they value the liberative power of free trade.
I mean, with that, I mean, we are running against the clock. What I'd like to do is perhaps wrap the panel here, but also open the floor up to a couple of questions, because it's such a emotional as well subject. So we can see if we have some other views in the room. But at this point, of course, a big thank you to our distinguished panel, and giving them a big round of applause, please. Thank you. And now maybe if you can just raise your hand if you have a question, and then we can see if we can get the microphone to you. Okay. Right here in the first row. Yeah, please. We've got the gentleman here on the right. Yeah, thanks.
My name's Greg Medcraft. I'm from the OECD, responsible for investment. I was just curious what you think about technology like blockchain, particularly enabling more inclusive growth in the coming years. Clearly it's something that we've been focusing on pretty heavily. I'm just curious comments on that. I have my own view, of course.
So any takers on
Okay, if I may
blockchain?
just first have a word about that. At Davos, I listened in the meeting of CEOs of some of the biggest banks in the world, and they accepted one thing, that cryptocurrencies are already an instrument in intra-bank relationships because of rapid transactions. But there's this flip side of it also, that blockchain technology is driven by a libertarian notion of freeing yourself from regulators. It was to a substantial extent that there's no state in our transaction. And I think, like Christian Lagarde said yesterday, at a certain point, a phenomenon as powerful as blockchain technology will have to be subject to the same regulations by state entities that other cross-cutting technologies have had to be.
I think, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest use that I see of blockchain technology in international trade is in traceability and transparency. A big part of the problem we have is opaque value chains. And what we have, while we have opaque value chains, is consumers that are demanding greater transparency over what's happening in the products, in the services they consume. So we in the International Trade Center are experimenting with blockchain technology, but it's for the traceability and transparency of value chains more than for the cryptocurrencies that, as Mukiza, I'm a bit skeptical about.
We have two areas where people have been discussing quite a lot. It's about reliability of the data banks and their trustworthiness. I think, for example, in customs cooperation, it has the potential to lower the cost of transactions significantly. A lot of the time that customs authorities spend today is on traceability, looking at how authentic the papers are, whether you're facing a fraudulent transaction or not. Those technologies can help immensely there. Another one is financing small and medium enterprises, for example. The small and medium enterprise, they get rejected by banks often. More than half the times they go to a bank, they're rejected. Most of the times because the banks don't know them. But if you had a technology that ensures traceability and credibility in the information, once you go through the process of screening by one bank, everybody else should benefit. But those technologies can help significantly in that area as well. There are many others. I'm just citing two examples.
Well, my feedback is wait and see, because I think there are a lot of challenges in there. Yes, maybe part of the blocks can be used right now.
Yeah.
But the other question is, will governments allow this to be taken by somebody else? You know, they are regulators, and they love to do that, as always. And that's why, for me, it's wait and see situation.
Yeah, we had a question. Let's try and balance it out a little bit. So we'll get her question, and then we'll go to you, if that's all right.
Wait.
I can hear you. It's not too much.
Okay, I'm Hind Lioha from the Ministry of Economy. His Excellency is our minister.
Before you start, if you can maybe target your question to one panelist instead of the whole panel, so that way we can
No,
get.
I'll keep it open.
No, no.
I will not target it. Okay.
You
please.
gotta choose.
You're the moderator. You decide.
All right.
Okay. The Bitcoin is a commodity or money considered in trade?
Any takers?
That's why I didn't direct the question.
The Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I see no takers on this one. You're out of luck. Really, no takers? Okay.
It's an expression of value. You can decide to commoditize it, but I think more an expression of value for transaction.
Yeah. I mean, that maybe goes to the minister's point as well, that we have to wait and see how this all evolves. Gentleman over there, yes?
I ask about report Azevedo, what about Doha round and why the WTO can't achieve the goals of Doha round until now, especially sixth topic in Singapore Ministerial Conference 1996, until now we negotiate about it. And what's the role of developing countries can do to increase the interest of the WTO and how you to interpret it, what's the role of developed countries to do to conclude this round, Doha round?
It is, I think, the big challenge that we have before us is what to do. It's a big undertaking. Clearly, a lot has changed since 2001. The politics, the players, the practices have changed as well. Like I said before, I don't think that many of the items that are under the Doha round can be forgotten. They're still very important. They're still very much on the agenda of the global economy today. So you cannot forget those things. The big discussion in the WTO today is how to tackle those issues. Some countries would like to continue to tackle them along the ways that we started the negotiations in 2001. Others are saying that did not work. We have to change. We have to take into account these new factors, these new elements in the conversation. That, I think, is the biggest challenge. I don't think anybody disputes the fact that those issues are important. Developing countries have made that clear. Developed countries also want to address many of those issues. It's a matter of deciding how to do it and how to make this agenda compatible with the agenda that includes areas like e-commerce, investment facilitation, small and medium enterprises, and all those things. And I think that if members are open-minded, what I keep telling members is be open-minded, be flexible. That's the only way forward. Listen to each other.
Okay.
Wear the shoes of the other side as well. I think they're beginning to do that. They're showing more flexibility. They're beginning to understand that we have to be open-minded in these conversations. Sorry? Both. Both.
I'm gonna have
I
to
can't hear you
jump
now.
in here because there's a few other. Well, let's take one more. I know we're on a tight schedule, so if we can take one more. I know you've had your hand up there. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Ayushi Gamadi. I am a student at Harvard Kennedy School under Danny Roderick and Robert Lawrence, among other professors. My question's for Dr. Acevedo. Oftentimes we see with increased trade liberalization, there's adverse effects on climate change, whether it's carbon leakage, increasing carbon footprints, or just kind of generally more adverse effects, particularly in developing countries. So what is the role of the WTO in regulating potentially adverse effects on the environment, and how do you see steps that your organization is taking moving forward?
Yeah, well, the first thing to understand is that the WTO is not an environmental agency, so we cannot address those elements. But to the extent that we can, I think as far as trade-related measures are concerned, there are several things that we can do. I think one area where we started to work with was an environmental goods agreement. So there was a number of countries that were negotiating how to make environmental goods technology cheaper so that it was more affordable to members of the WTO, and therefore would encourage countries to adopt clean technologies. That is something that we were working on. Related, but not to climate change, but related to that is the fisheries conversation. So now we're trying to see how do we reduce the subsidies for fisheries which lead to overfishing. And other initiatives like that. Members have full control. What is important to understand is the WTO doesn't limit the ability of any country to introduce measures that reduce the carbon footprint. There is absolutely no impediment. The WTO is not in the way of any of that. On the contrary, to the extent that we can help, we will. But a lot of that has to come from the members. So they have to tell us what it is that they want to do. We try to help the conversation, but they have to drive this agenda forward.
You wanted to
Yes,
weigh in
just
briefly?
to supplement that. I run a United Nations initiative called Sustainable Stock Exchanges, which now has 90% of the largest stock exchanges in the world. What we do is encourage business-driven ecological solutions, like inclusion of carbon and social audits of entities that are quoted on stock exchanges, so that the carbon cost of any production process is part of the cost of that production. And similarly, we're encouraging the reform of curricula in business schools to have the triple bottom line of social, ecological, and economic considerations, and to be written into auditing practices by different audit organizations around the world. Such initiatives talk to compatibility between enterprise and greening.
Any additional views on this particular subject? Or?
Not my-
Okay, all right. Well, I think with that we'll wrap it up. And again, thank you very much for your time. It's been a very interesting debate. It's been a privilege to host it for you. And yeah, have a great day, or at least what's left of it. Thank you very much.